We're going to be talking about today the Gallic Singularity in regard to women in France. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tracey Adams, our first speaker, who has a PhD in French from Johns Hopkins University and is Associate Professor in European Languages and Literatures at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She's also taught at the University of Maryland, the University of Miami, and the University of Lyon, Troyes. She was a Uriah Senior Fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in 2011-2012, an Australian Research Council Center of Excellence in the History of Emotions, Distinguished International Visiting Fellow in 2014, and a fellow at the Herzog August Bibliothek Fellowship in Wolfenbüttel, Germany in 2016. She gets around. She is the author of Violent Passions, Managing Love in the Old French Verse Romance, 2005, The Life and Afterlife of Isabeau of Bavaria, 2010, and Christine de Pizan and the Fight for France. I really like that book, in 2014. With Christine Adams, the next speaker, and also her sister, she edited Female Beauty Systems, Beauty is Social Capital in Western Europe and the US, Middle Ages to the Present, published in 2015. And also with Christine, she is completing The French Royal Mistress and the Politics of Representation, which is under contract with Penn State University Press. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Okay. So the Gallic Singularity, that is the harmonious relationship between the sexes, which are themselves understood to be fundamentally and naturally different from but complementary to each other, a relationship enacted through galanterie and conversation, may well be more perception than reality. Éric Fassin, from whom I borrow the expression, and many others have shown how varied French feminisms is or are. And yet, even though the Gallic Singularity may be neither specifically Gallic nor singular, and even though we may not find it a useful category for analyzing modern French feminist scholarship, it's so deeply ingrained in popular perceptions of the French, among the French themselves, and among those who study the French, that I think it's worth thinking about where the perception comes from in the first place. And so, in what follows, I will lay out a brief early genealogy of the Gallic Singularity, suggesting that in contrast with the common dating of the concept to the 18th century by Mona Ouzouf and many others, we need to go back to the literature and law of the 12th century, which then, as later, embodied a certain ideology of women. So we'll focus first on the medieval French romance, and from there we'll look at feudal law, where we see the first traces of the paradox that I suggest characterizes the Gallic Singularity almost from its inception. Then we'll move to Christine de Pizan, Parisian writer of the early 15th century, who first articulates the concept. And then from there, we'll look briefly at the so-called Salic law, which resulted in female relatives, generally the queen mother, being preferred over male relatives as regents for a minor king. I then pass the floor to my colleagues, who will continue this historicization of the Gallic Singularity. The Gallic Singularity is already perceptible in the earliest romances. The concept of courtly love originated in scholar Gaston Paris' two now renowned articles of 1881 and 1883 on the late 12th century romance Le Chevalier de la Charrette, or The Knight of the Cart, the work in which the 12th century author Chrétien de Troyes brings Lancelot and Guinevere together as lovers for the first time. Numerous studies have targeted the social and familiar environments within which Gaston Paris created the concept of courtly love, and I would just add to these that Paris' interpretation of Guinevere's haughtiness, her refusal to speak to the lovesick Lancelot, who had just rescued her, must be read in the context of 19th century notions of hysteria, which was itself as much a literary phenomenon as an illness, eroticized at the time in literary analyses of such heroines as Emma Bovary and many others. Thanks to Paris' interpretation of Guinevere's treatment of Lancelot as capricious and somewhat hysterical, medieval romance has come to be perceived as inhabited by fickle courtly ladies. And yet, In fact, this work is about nothing so much as how to bring male and female will, or volonté or vouloir, as it's called, into joyous alignment. When after many adventures, Lancelot and Guinevere come together for their single night of joy in an allegory of consensual sexual relations, Lancelot asks Guinevere whether he should pull the grill from her window. He's standing outside and he wants to know, should he come in, enter her room through this grill? And he specifically says he will not force his way in through the grilled window unless she wills it. And she replies, certes, je le veux bien, mais vouloir pas ne vaut détient. The romance holds Lancelot and Guinevere up as the ideal couple, contrasting them with a series of sexually aggressive knights and their unwilling partners on the one hand, and the apathetic King Arthur on the other. The romance's repeated references to the lovers' shared will evokes 12th century writing on friendship, which itself draws on Cicero. However, in English literature, different from French literature, Lancelot and Guinevere's affair becomes significantly more ambivalent, and it never even makes it into German medieval literature, although Chrétien's other romances are indeed translated into German. So Lancelot and Guinevere, the Gallic Singularity. Turning to feudal law, I would emphasize just that in many versions of feudal law, women were conceived of as simultaneously equal and inferior to men of their same rank, that is, as intellectually equal, but because of their natural differences, as legally inferior. Women were capable, as evidenced by the fact that they were allowed to wield authority in the absence of a husband, son, or brother, but inferior, as evidenced by the fact that they were allowed to wield authority only under such circumstances. And there are hundreds of examples of this, but just one. In a letter of 1164 to Louis VII, a knight refuses to appear before the Viscountess of Narbonne, basing his case on Roman law, which specifies that a woman cannot act as a judge. But Louis VII replies that when there is no member of the strong sex, it is permissible that a woman serve as a judge. So the notions of shared will, as opposed to forced obedience, Lancelot and Guinevere, and of intellectual equality coupled with legal inferiority, together bring us to Christine de Pizan, who is also a political theoretician, among many other things. True, for Christine, women were excluded from certain positions by nature, by nature with a capital N, Christine writes, that is, the divinely ordained hierarchy. But this does not mean that women are incompetent. In the Livre de la Cité des Dames of 1405, the allegorical character Reason gives examples of women who have natural sense, sens naturel, for government. Intelligent women were capable of anything, but, Christine says, we quote from Christine, God wanted men and women to serve him differently and to help each other and give each other mutual aid, each according to his manner. And he thus created the two sexes to be of different natures, as necessary to the accomplishment of the tasks. Men were hot, says Christine, and therefore less capable of reflection, whereas women were moist and cold, and therefore more peaceful and capable of reflection. Women were not any less intelligent or capable than men, they were complementary to men. To begin making the transition to my colleague's essay and the powerful royal mistress as the epitome of the Gallic singularity, I would just point out that the powerful royal mistress arose at roughly the same time as the equally complex phenomenon of female regency. After naming his brother Louis of Orleans regent in 1393, in 1403, so after naming him regent in 1393, in 1403, the periodically mad King Charles VI abolished regency altogether in an ordinance proclaiming that the heir to the throne, whatever his age, would take power immediately upon the king's death. However, the ordinance continues, until the new king attained the age at which he could govern in his own person, the queen, aided by the king's male relatives, would rule in his name. Female regency was thus built on the paradoxical vision of women that lay also behind feudal law provisions for women to exercise power as substitutes for their absent husbands, fathers, sons, or brothers. Enshrined in the so-called Salic law, discussed with increasing attention from about 1420, this vision of women prohibited women from ascending the throne or even transmitting the right to ascend the throne. The development of Salic law over the 14th century is well known, so I won't rehash it, except to say that it paradoxically resulted in a preference for women, normally the queen mother, as regents, who, unlike male relatives, could not ascend and therefore posed no danger. and for approximately a fourth of the years between 1484 and 1661, when Louis XIV assumed personal rule, 5 female regents effectively governed the kingdom, or in other words, 5 female regents ruled in a kingdom that explicitly prohibited from doing so, and this is exactly the Gallic Singularity. The powerful royal mistress was supported by the same ideology that supported the female regent, but here the pertinent context isn't the family, but rather the circle of royal mignons, or as they were called from the 16th century, the favorites. These young men of mid-level provincial nobility were not clients of great lords, but pledged themselves directly to the king and thus were absolutely loyal to the king. If the mignons reached the apogee of their influence under Henry III, however, the category existed well before, from about 1445, or about the time of the rise of Agnès Sorel, the famous mistress of Charles VII. And from that period, Charles VII is described as surrounded by mignons. The chronicler Thomas Bassin writes that after a chaste youth, the middle-aged king, Charles VII, drew himself a crowd of flattering attendants who attracted grace and favor to themselves, and that just after the truce with the English, he fell in love with Agnès. So now to draw the link between the female regent and the powerful royal mistress more precisely, each represented a level of selfless devotion to the king, far surpassing that of any man, whose self-interested ambitions always threatened to put him at odds with the king. So why not the queen instead of the mistress as the most loyal advisor? Well, from the time of François I's second wife, Eleanor of Austria, during whose tenure, so she became queen in 1530 and remained so until François' death in 1547, the Duchesse d'Étampes, the most famous mistress of François I, during this time, she reached her apogee. And during this time, or from that time on, the queens of France, with just one exception, were all foreign-born. And their husbands, the kings, all possessed powerful mistresses, except for Catherine de Médici's 3 sons, all of whom relied heavily on their mother for political advice, on a woman, and Louis XIII, who preferred, he had mentors, but they were male. Because for the mistress there was no risk of a prior, stronger commitment to a foreign dynasty, which was always a potential problem with the foreign queen, in the absence of an influential queen mother, the mistress could become the king's most intimate advisor and a serious political actor. So French kings, from Charles VI on, with just a few exceptions, seem to have appreciated women not simply as decorations or embodiments of alliances, but as actual political advisors. The roles of female regent and powerful royal mistress, thus, must be seen within this more fundamental context of the king's reliance on a female advisor, itself a function of the gender ideology that saw women as intellectual equals but legal inferiors, and because of this very inferiority and the implied inability for women to assume power for themselves as the best choice for intimate political advisors, and this, of course, is precisely the Gallic Singularity. The Gallic Singularity can also be felt in the absence of any widespread courtesan culture in France, I suggest in conclusion. Despite the verifiable extra-conjugal romantic liaison of cultivated noble women who lived with and served the queen, these women cannot be considered courtesans. They didn't trade in sex, although they were sometimes accused of promiscuity. Nor was Salon society a form of courtesan culture. Sex wasn't traded in this context either. On the other hand, the so-called kept women of the demi-monde from the mid-18th century on in France weren't courtesans in the commonly accepted sense of the term because they lacked the education that would have made them capable of elevated conversation expected of courtesans in other cultures. So once again, I would invoke the Gallic Singularity. In France, women were visible and integral participants in elite social life. Their presence was too valuable to diminish by openly associating them with sexual relations, which would have created an intolerable ambivalence. The desire to draw a clear line between female conversation and prostitution, the former being so highly valued within this culture that recognized men and women as intellectual, if not legal equals, made courtesanship rare. So this genealogy, which will be carried on by my colleagues, seems to me, behind the most recent reluctance to accept the headscarf or the burkini, anchoring these present issues in a long past. And I would suggest here that the Gallic Singularity is also, it's also central to a certain type of French or primarily masculine identity, so central to that disrupting its central tenet, that is the complementarity or the complementary relationship between the sexes, by symbolically rendering invisible the outward signs of female difference, hair, female shape, is received as an attack on a uniquely French way of existing in the world whose roots go back to the 12th century. And so to return to my opening remark, whether the Gallic singularity actually exists or whether or not it's a useful tool for analysis, it is a popular perception that continues to hold force. But I think by thinking about its long genealogy, it may be possible to think about which aspects of this history merit inclusion in modern French identity and which should be rethought.